Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the medieval world. So, dim the lights, breathe slowly, and imagine, just for a moment, that you've been dropped into a city from 700 years ago. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, wet hay, and that very particular mix of beer and sewage that no scented candle company has ever tried to recreate. You hear horses clattering down narrow cobbled streets, church bells in the distance, and, tucked away in the shadows, behind sagging shutters, sits a brothel. Not the romanticized kind from Hollywood, full of velvet drapes and coquettish banter. More the medieval reality. Rickety timber buildings, straw-covered floors, and a vague sense that something sticky is going to get on your shoes no matter how careful you are. And inside, of course, there were women, working, surviving, and sometimes raising children. Which leads us to the question that people rarely pause to ask. What actually happened to the children born in medieval brothels? The short answer is, not a lot of good. The longer answer, well, that's what we're here for tonight. So, let's settle in. First, let's clear away the obvious. Medieval society didn't exactly have a robust support system for children of sex workers. If you were born in a brothel, you arrived in the world with 3 strikes already against you. Strike 1, you were illegitimate, which in medieval Europe was basically a lifelong stain on your paperwork, assuming anyone even bothered to record your existence. Strike 2, you were usually poor. Strike 3, you were publicly associated with sin, not exactly the kind of resume that gets you knighted by the king. But let's drift closer. Imagine one of these children, born in, say, 14th century Paris. The brothel itself might be licensed, because yes, some cities did officially license and tax prostitution, which is an oddly bureaucratic way of admitting we can't stop this, so we may as well profit from it. Municipal officials would actually designate certain streets or houses for the trade, often near city gates or docks. And if a child was born there, the city was unlikely to be surprised. But they weren't exactly rushing to help either. Many of these children simply didn't survive infancy. Harsh, but true. Medieval infant mortality was already high, and in the unsanitary environment of a brothel, it was even higher. Babies are delicate creatures, and medieval medicine was essentially a game of guess and bleed. Combine that with mothers who were overworked, underfed, and often treated as expendable, and the survival rate drops fast. For those who did survive, their lives took a few different paths, none of them especially glamorous. Some were fostered out, handed over to wet nurses or other women who could at least provide basic care. There are records of certain cities requiring prostitutes who gave birth to send their babies to convent-run orphanages, which is about as medieval as it gets. You're born in a brothel, and the church immediately relocates you into a drafty stone convent. Welcome to life. Now, here's where it gets socially interesting. If a child grew up in the brothel itself, they often became part of the household economy. That sounds much nicer than it was. What it really means is that children helped out however they could. Fetching water, cleaning floors, running errands. Basically, free labor. Childhood as we imagine it today, full of toys, school, and carefree afternoons, didn't exist for most medieval kids, and it certainly didn't exist here. Some daughters followed their mothers into the profession. It wasn't always a choice. Poverty, stigma, and the lack of other opportunities made the path depressingly linear. You were born in a brothel, you grew up in one, and eventually you worked in one. Sons, meanwhile, sometimes took on menial roles connected to the trade. They might become tavern hands, guards, or the kind of small-time hustlers who hung around red light districts. Social mobility wasn't entirely impossible, but it was about as likely as your local priest suddenly giving up celibacy. And let's not forget the wonderful world of medieval insults. Children of sex workers were frequently targeted with slurs and ridicule. The term whoreson was a common insult across Europe, thrown around in taverns and streets alike. Shakespeare used it all the time, proof that by the early modern period the stigma was still alive and kicking. Being labeled as such could close doors before you ever had a chance to knock on them. But were all their lives bleak? Not entirely. Some did find ways to climb out of the brothel shadow. There are scattered records of children being absorbed into apprenticeships, bakers, smiths, even minor clerical positions. It often depended on whether their mothers managed to form connections outside the brothel walls. Maybe a regular client took an interest. Maybe a sympathetic patron pulled strings. It wasn't common, but it wasn't impossible. There's also the strange paradox of the church. Officially, the church condemned prostitution. Unofficially, it tolerated it, taxed it, and even provided rules for managing it. So while children of prostitutes were technically tainted, the church sometimes ended up raising them in orphanages or convents. A life of poverty still awaited, but at least it came with 3 meals a day and the occasional hymn. Now, let's step back and take in the irony. Medieval rulers were constantly obsessed with lineage, legitimacy, and bloodlines. If you were the son of a king, your birth was celebrated with feasts, bells, and a parade of priests waving incense. If you were the son of a brothel, your birth was celebrated with silence, maybe a frown, possibly a shrug. You were invisible to the system. And yet, in the daily hum of city life, these children were everywhere. They were part of the workforce, part of the noise of the streets, part of the unseen fabric of medieval towns. They lived on the margins, shaping history in small, unrecorded ways, carrying water, running messages, growing up into nameless adults who blended into the crowd. History books rarely mention them, because history books were written about the powerful, not the expendable. But here's the quiet truth. For every noble child whose lineage was carefully preserved in gold-leaf manuscripts, there were dozens of children in brothels, born without fanfare, surviving however they could. Their stories weren't glamorous, but they were real. And sometimes, the most honest reflection of a society comes not from its kings, but from the children it tried to ignore. And so when we ask what happened to children born in medieval brothels, the answer is simple. Most didn't make it. Those who did often inherited a cycle of poverty and stigma. A few slipped through the cracks into ordinary trades, vanishing into the larger medieval crowd. And almost none left their names in the records. They are, in a way, the silent background of history, the forgotten lull between royal scandals and knightly battles, which makes them perfect to think about as we drift towards sleep. Hey everyone, let's drift onward tonight, away from the children of brothels, and toward another strange corner of medieval and early modern society. One of those professions everyone knew existed, but nobody wanted to think about too hard. The executioner. Now, when you picture an executioner, your brain probably defaults to the cartoon version. A hulking man in a black hood, swinging an axe that's clearly too heavy to be practical. A figure of menace, standing in the shadows, waiting for the next unlucky criminal to meet the chopping block. And yes, sometimes they did wear hoods, but in reality, executioners were not faceless monsters. They were ordinary men with jobs, albeit very unusual jobs. And the real curiosity lies not in what they did during executions, but in what they did the rest of the time. Because here's the thing, executions didn't happen every day. If you were the official executioner of a city, you might be called out a handful of times a year, depending on how crime and politics were going, which left you with a lot of downtime. And like anyone else, executioners had to fill it. They had to eat, sleep, pay bills, and deal with neighbors. The problem? Neighbors didn't want to deal with them. Executioners lived in a kind of social purgatory. They were necessary, but hated. Cities literally required someone to do the job, yet they treated the men who did it as unclean, cursed, or at best, deeply awkward. In many towns, executioners were forced to live in separate quarters, often near the city gates. Out of sight, out of mind. It's like putting the trash bins at the edge of the yard. Convenient, but you don't want them right next to your roses. So what did these men do all day? Well, ironically, many of them became experts in medicine. I know, that sounds like the setup for a bad joke. But it's true. Because they handled bodies so often, executioners picked up practical knowledge about anatomy, wounds, and healing. If you had an ulcer or a nasty cut, or even certain chronic illnesses, you might quietly sneak off to see the local executioner. He'd probably know more about treating it than the average barber surgeon, who was mostly trained in bloodletting and vague Latin incantations. Some executioners became famous for their cures. There are records of them collecting herbs, preparing salves, and even selling little packets of medicinal powder. Of course, there's also the slightly grimmer detail. They sometimes made medicines out of the remains of executed criminals. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. Ground up skull fragments, fat, or blood, turned into remedies for epilepsy, gout, or, you guessed it, ulcers again. Because in medieval medicine, if it seemed gross, it probably counted as a treatment. Beyond medicine, executioners often doubled as butchers. The connection is obvious: sharp blades, steady hands, and a lack of squeamishness. Some were officially licensed to run butcher stalls, which made for a strange dynamic. On Monday, you might buy a slab of pork from him. On Tuesday, you might watch him decapitate your cousin. Talk about customer loyalty programs. They also performed odd jobs nobody else wanted. Need a dead animal hauled out of the street? Ask the executioner. Need to clean up a mess after a violent tavern brawl? Executioner. Need to test out new torture devices, because yes, cities tested them. Guess who drew the short straw? These men were like the municipal janitors of horror. And then there was the showmanship. Executions were public events, often treated as grim entertainment. The executioner wasn't just there to swing a sword. He was part of the performance. A bad executioner, one who botched the job and took 5 or 6 strikes to finish it, could be jeered, pelted, or even attacked by the crowd. A skilled one, who made it quick and clean, might actually be respected. In a very peculiar way, they were judged as performers, their reputations rising and falling with the efficiency of their work. But outside the square, they were still social pariahs. People crossed the street to avoid them. Children were told not to play near their homes. Executioners' families carried the same stigma. Their wives and children found it nearly impossible to marry into respectable households. Many executioners came from dynasties of executioners, passing the job down from father to son, not because it was glamorous, but because no one else wanted to marry into the family anyway. It was an inherited career in the same way a family curse is inherited. One example is the Sanson family of France, who served as executioners in Paris for 6 generations. The most famous of them, Charles-Henri Sanson, presided over the guillotine during the French Revolution. But before he reached that historical stage, his ancestors had already been plying the trade generation after generation, partly because the stigma locked them into it. Once you were an executioner's child, your career options were roughly 1. Executioner, or 2. Deeply unemployed. And yet, here's the irony again. Despite being outcasts, executioners were sometimes treated with strange forms of respect. Towns gave them special privileges, perhaps to make up for the fact that nobody wanted to befriend them. They were allowed free beer at taverns. They could sometimes wear swords in public when ordinary citizens couldn't. In some places, they were exempt from taxes, which is almost like the city saying, "We don't like you, but we do like your work. Please keep cutting off heads." Executioners also became figures of folk superstition. Some people believed they carried luck or even magical protection simply by touching them. Others thought the exact opposite, that they carried curses. Either way, they existed in that liminal space of both feared and needed, shunned but indispensable, like the human equivalent of garlic, useful, smelly, and not something you want too close. So, what about their day-to-day lives? We know they trained apprentices. We know they sharpened weapons, sometimes obsessively. Executioners often practiced on animals or wooden dummies, keeping their aim precise. They needed to be efficient, because a clumsy blow didn't just humiliate them, it could spark a riot. People tolerated executions, but they hated watching prolonged suffering. So in a very practical sense, a good executioner had to maintain his professional edge. At home, they lived fairly ordinary domestic lives. They cooked meals, raised children, and argued about money, just like anyone else. The difference was that their children grew up knowing their father's job made them untouchable. It was a strange kind of normal, sitting at the dinner table knowing Dad's day involved both selling bacon and quartering a thief. Now, let's glide into one of the strangest parts of their existence, their relationship with criminals. In some cases, executioners had to act as jailers, keeping prisoners until their appointed day, which means they might spend weeks chatting, feeding, and caring for a man, only to be the one who killed him. Imagine that emotional whiplash. It was a grim version of customer service. "How's your stew? Good? Okay, see you Tuesday morning for the beheading." And criminals themselves often feared executioners more than the judge. The judge sentenced you, but the executioner determined how clean or messy your end would be. Some prisoners tried to bribe them for a quick death. Others begged them to say prayers or deliver messages afterward. It was a twisted intimacy, forged at the edge of life. So, how did executioners live when they weren't killing people? They lived on the margins. They were butchers, healers, garbage collectors, and sometimes accidental celebrities. They were hated in public but needed in private. They were feared at a distance but quietly consulted when your legs started rotting. They were men whose lives were defined by other people's endings. And in the end, they remind us that medieval society was built on 100 small contradictions. You could be both indispensable and despised, respected for your skill, yet barred from polite company, a healer by day, an executioner by morning, and a lonely figure by night, which in its own way makes them perfect for our drifting bedtime history, because the lives of executioners weren't just about death. They were about the awkward, uncomfortable space between life and death, the long, quiet hours when nobody was watching and the axe was hanging on the wall. Hey everyone. Let's drift into another quiet corner of history tonight. We've spent some time with the forgotten children of brothels and the lonely lives of executioners. Now let's tiptoe into castles and courts. Not the glamorous movie castles with sweeping staircases and glittering chandeliers. The real ones, cold, drafty, smelling faintly of damp stone, boiled cabbage, and chamber pots that hadn't been emptied fast enough. Inside, beneath all the pomp and ceremony, lived the royal households. Kings, queens, and princes, yes, but also the army of people who served them. Servants who poured their wine, laced their boots, and picked up after their meltdowns. And here's where things get interesting. Because those servants saw everything. They were the silent background in every royal drama. They held the chamber pots. They tucked in the children. They refilled the goblets. And in the process, they sometimes stumbled upon royal secrets, affairs, illegitimate births, treasonous letters, strange habits, odd illnesses, and all the little details the monarch would have preferred to keep tucked under the bed covers. So what happened when servants discovered those secrets? Well, the short answer is, it depended. Sometimes, knowing too much was dangerous. Other times, it was a ticket to influence. And occasionally, it was just deeply awkward. First, let's talk about the risk. Servants lived dangerously close to their masters, but that closeness came with no safety net. If you discovered something you weren't supposed to know, you carried it like a ticking time bomb. Royal families were obsessed with controlling their image. Every dynasty wanted to look perfect, legitimate, God-appointed. A servant who could puncture that illusion was like a loose thread on a tapestry, small, but capable of unraveling everything. Take the example of Edward II of England, famously incompetent, fond of his male favorites, and generally disliked by his nobles. His personal life was the stuff of whispered gossip. Servants in his household certainly knew more than anyone else about his relationships, his eccentricities, and his failures. Some kept their mouths shut, blending into the furniture. Others whispered, and those whispers helped feed the revolts against him. Being too chatty could literally contribute to a king's downfall. Not that the servants were thanked afterward. And then there's the French court under Louis XIV. The Sun King loved ceremony. Every moment of his day was a performance, and every servant had a role. From the man who handed him his wig to the one who wiped his royal bottom. Yes, that was an actual job title. Servants saw everything. And what did they get in return? A mix of privilege and peril. Some rose high by guarding secrets carefully. Others were ruined when they repeated the wrong piece of gossip at the wrong time. But it wasn't all doom. Some servants managed to parlay their insider knowledge into power. If you could keep a royal's secrets, you became indispensable. Monarchs valued loyalty, sometimes more than skill. A king might trust his valet, who dressed him every morning, more than his most decorated general. That valet knew which days the king's gout was flaring, when he was in a foul mood, and when to slip a gentle word of advice. Royal mistresses, too, relied on their servants to protect them. A lady's maid might know every detail of her mistress's late-night rendezvous. If she kept quiet, she gained her mistress's favor. If she spoke, she risked her mistress's ruin, and possibly her own, because no one trusted a disloyal servant. The Spanish Habsburgs are a classic example of how this worked. Their court was a maze of gossip, inbreeding, and fragile egos. Charles II of Spain famous for being both king and medically unfortunate, was surrounded by servants who knew just how dire his health was. They saw his seizures, his stunted body, his infertility. And yet, publicly, everyone pretended he was fine. Servants had to maintain the illusion. Breaking it would have been unthinkable. So they lived in silence, carrying the truth like a secret they could never unload. Of course, sometimes secrets slipped out anyway. Servants were human. They gossiped. And in royal courts, gossip was practically a currency. A kitchen maid might pass a tidbit to a guard. The guard might tell a courtier. By the time it reached the nobles, it had morphed into something entirely different, usually more scandalous. It's one of the reasons so many royal rumors from history are contradictory. Was Queen X having an affair? Was Prince Y legitimate? Who really poisoned the soup? Half the time, the answer came down to what a bored servant whispered after too much ale. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When secrets became politically dangerous, servants were the first to suffer. They were easy scapegoats. If a letter went missing, blame the servant. If rumors spread, blame the servant. If a scandal leaked, blame the servant. Sometimes they were executed, sometimes merely dismissed, and sometimes quietly vanished. After all, royals couldn't risk admitting their own mistakes. Much easier to pin it on the lowly maid who was just trying to scrub the floor. There were, however, servants who played the game masterfully. Some became shadowy power brokers, the ones who knew exactly when to leak a secret and when to stay silent. Think of them as the medieval version of press managers. They had no official titles, but their influence was enormous. A clever chamberlain or lady's maid could make or break reputations. They were the invisible hands guiding the machinery of scandal. One famous case is that of Louis XV's Parc aux Cerfs, his private house for mistresses. The servants who managed it knew everything. They arranged the liaisons, covered the tracks, and kept their mouths shut. Those who succeeded were rewarded handsomely. Those who slipped disappeared from the records, and likely from life. Let's also not forget the everyday secrets. Royals weren't just hiding affairs or treason. They were hiding embarrassing habits. George III of Britain, for example, famously suffered bouts of madness. His servants witnessed his rambling conversations, his strange fits, and his tendency to talk to trees. For years, they kept it quiet, because the monarchy depended on the illusion of stability. Imagine being the butler who had to nod politely while the king discussed foreign policy with an oak. Or take Henry VIII. Everyone remembers the 6 wives, but fewer people think about the poor souls who had to manage his increasingly foul temper, his ulcerating leg wounds, and his paranoia. His servants saw it all. They were the ones changing the bandages, disposing of the pus-soaked rags, and listening to his midnight rages. Did they talk? Not if they valued their heads. Henry wasn't exactly known for his forgiving nature. So what happened to the servants who discovered royal secrets? Some were ruined. Some were executed. Some vanished into silence. But others rose quietly, gaining influence not by speaking, but by keeping their lips sealed.